They told her she was too big, too rough, too different to belong anywhere. So she stopped trying to belong. Instead, she chose to survive. But survival has a way of turning into something more, something dangerous, something unstoppable. Because when a woman who has nothing left to lose finally finds her place, she doesn't just live, she changes everything around her. And tonight, you're about to witness exactly what that looks like.
Oakhaven didn't welcome strangers, and it certainly didn't welcome women who cast shadows like a full-grown lumberjack. The stagecoach dropped me off at the edge of town just as the first flurry of winter snow began to mix with the bitter red dust of the frontier. I stepped down, my heavy leather boots hitting the frozen dirt with a solid thud. At 26, I had long ago made peace with the fact that I was not built for silk dresses or courting parlors. I was a behemoth of a woman, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands chapped raw by lye soap, and scarred from years of wrestling with cast-iron skillets and open flames. I didn't just take up space, I commanded it. And in a place like Oakhaven, that made me a freak. I felt the stairs before I even hoisted my battered wooden chest onto my shoulder. A group of well-dressed ladies on the boardwalk pulled their fur-lined coats tighter, stepping back as if my sheer size might be contagious. "Good Lord," I heard one whisper, her voice carrying sharply on the wind. "Look at the shoulders on her. She looks like a lumberjack in a skirt." I didn't flinch. I had built a callus over my heart long before the ones on my hands. I spent the next hour walking down Main Street, dragging my trunk from the boarding house to the hotel, and finally to the local saloon. The answers were always the same, delivered with eyes that looked everywhere but at my face. "No vacancies. We don't hire your kind. Try the next town over." They didn't want a woman who looked like she could wrestle a steer. They wanted someone small, someone they could easily ignore or command. When the mercantile owner shooed me out like a stray dog, I stopped a weathered old station master on the corner. "I need work," I told him, my voice rough from the cold. "Cooking. Who's hiring?" He eyed my trunk, then my thick arms, and spat a stream of tobacco into the dirt. "Only place desperate enough right now is Ironwood, 10 miles north, but Silas Thorne ain't exactly known for his hospitality." 10 miles, on foot, in the biting snow. I didn't hesitate. I adjusted the strap of my trunk and started walking. The wind howled across the open plains, biting through my wool coat like a swarm of angry wasps. By mile 5, my legs were numb. By mile 8, the snow was gathering on my eyelashes, and my lungs burned with every breath. But I kept putting one foot in front of the other. The frontier was cruel, but hunger was crueler. It was late afternoon when the silhouette of Ironwood Ranch finally materialized through the whiteout. It looked like a fortress, harsh, unyielding, built of dark timber and stubborn stone against the unforgiving landscape. Before I even reached the main yard, I heard it, the rhythmic, deafening clang of a hammer striking an anvil. I followed the sound toward an open-sided forge attached to the barn, and there he was, Silas Thorne. The contrast hit me so hard it knocked the breath out of my already burning lungs. I was freezing, shivering beneath layers of heavy wool, my face numb from the blizzard. He was practically radiating heat. Despite the freezing temperature, he had stripped down to a sweat-soaked thermal undershirt. He was a giant, easily towering over 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the dying sun. He swung a heavy blacksmith's hammer with terrifying, effortless power, shaping a glowing horseshoe on the anvil. As he turned his head, the fiery light of the forge illuminated his face. A jagged, brutal scar slashed diagonally across his cheek and over the bridge of his nose, making him look less like a man and more like a force of nature. He didn't hear me approach over the roar of the fire and the ringing of iron. I dropped my trunk into the snow. The heavy thwack made him stop. He lowered the hammer. Slowly, he turned to face me. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Silas Thorne stared at me, his eyes the color of a frozen lake. I stared back. There was no pity in his gaze, no disgust at my size, no shock. just a raw, primal assessment. We were two giants, two scarred, rough-hewn outcasts, standing in the snow, measuring each other. Before either of us could speak, the wind shifted, carrying a foul, acrid stench across the yard. It was coming from the cookhouse. Burnt beans, charred, ruined meat, the smell of a crew that was starving because nobody knew how to tend a hearth. My stomach rumbled, but my pride roared louder. I didn't ask for a job. I didn't beg for shelter. I knelt in the snow, unlatched my wooden trunk, and reached past the clothes I owned to grab the only thing that truly mattered to me. My fingers wrapped around the worn wooden handle of my heavy carbon steel chef's knife. I stood back up, the blade glinting menacingly in the forge's light. Silas's grip tightened on his hammer, his entire massive frame going rigid, ready for a fight. Instead of attacking, I pointed the tip of the blade straight at the smoking cookhouse. "Your camp smells like a crematorium," I said, my voice cutting through the wind, loud and steady. "Give me a corner of that kitchen. And 3 days, just 3 days, Mr. Thorne, and I'll show you and your men what human food actually tastes like." Silas didn't blink. He looked at the knife in my hand, then at the fierce, unyielding set of my jaw. The tension in the air was so thick you could have struck a match on it. Finally, the giant rancher slowly lowered his hammer. His jaw shifted, and for a fraction of a second, something that might have been respect flared in his icy eyes. He gave one single, curt nod. "Kitchen's on the left," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Don't burn the rest of it down." I didn't smile. I just gripped my knife, picked up my trunk, and walked into the fire. The cookhouse of the Ironwood Ranch was not a kitchen. It was a crime scene. When I pushed open the heavy oak door, the hinges shrieked in protest, as if warning me to turn back. The air inside was a physical wall of freezing drafts and stale, rancid smoke. It smelled of burnt fat, soured beans, and the kind of deep, pervasive neglect that only a house full of exhausted, desperate men could produce. I stood in the doorway, my large frame blocking the swirling snow from entering the room, and took inventory. The hearth was a graveyard of gray ash and blackened logs. A massive cast-iron stove sat in the corner, its surface crusted with layers of boiled-over stews and charred grease. On the long wooden dining table, a lone tin plate held a lump of something indistinguishable that had frozen solid to the metal. For a moment, I just stared at it all. Any other woman would have wept. Some might have turned around, walked back out into the blizzard, and taken their chances with the wolves. I rolled up my sleeves. "All right, you ugly beast," I muttered to the cast-iron stove. "Let's see what you're made of." I didn't have 3 days. I had until sundown. If I was going to prove my worth to Silas Thorne, the first meal had to be a revelation. I started with the fire. I shoveled out months of dead ash, my knuckles scraping against the rough brick. My hands, large and thickly calloused, were perfectly suited for the brutal work. I built a teepee of kindling, struck a match, and coaxed a small, fragile flame into existence. As the fire grew, snapping and eating the dry wood, the temperature in the room began its slow, agonizing climb from freezing to bearable. Next came the water. I found a massive iron cauldron, hauled it out to the frozen pump in the yard, broke the ice with the heel of my boot, and lugged it back inside full to the brim. Hauling that kind of dead weight would have torn the shoulders of a lesser woman, but my broad back took the strain easily. Once the water was boiling, the true exorcism began. I used lye soap, coarse salt, and wire brushes to scrub the cast-iron skillets until they gleamed dull and black, the way they were meant to. I scoured the wooden countertops, scraping away the hardened grime until the pale, raw wood beneath was exposed. With every scrub, every sweep, every violent motion of my arms, I was claiming this territory. I was sweating now, my wool coat discarded, the thermal shirt clinging to my broad shoulders. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the snow-covered plains, the cookhouse had been transformed. The harsh, freezing blue light of the winter storm outside was entirely blocked out. Inside, the room glowed with the warm, flickering orange light of a roaring hearth fire. But the real magic was the smell, was the end. I had raided the meager pantry. It was disastrously low, but I had found enough. A cured ham hock, some dried pinto beans, a sack of flour, a jar of preserved tomatoes, and a few withered onions. It wasn't a feast for kings, but in my hands it was alchemy. A massive pot of thick, hearty stew bubbled on the back of the stove, the ham hock lending its smoky, salty depth to the beans and tomatoes. But the centerpiece, the thing that would break these men, was the bread. I had proofed the dough near the hearth, letting the yeast awaken and swell. I formed them into massive, rustic loaves, and baked them until the crusts were a deep, resonant mahogany. The smell of freshly baked bread and rich, rendering fat filled every crack and crevice of the cabin. It smelled like home. It smelled like survival. I heard them before I saw them, the heavy crunch of boots in the snow, the low, exhausted murmurs of men who had spent 12 hours fighting the winter to keep their cattle alive. The door swung open, bringing a violent gust of snow with it. The first man to step inside was an older fellow, his face lined like a dried riverbed, his beard white with frost. He stopped dead in his tracks. Behind him, 3 other men piled in, bumping into him. "Elias, what the hell are you stopping?" a younger voice complained before trailing off into absolute silence. 8 men filed into the cookhouse. 8 hardened, freezing, exhausted ranch hands. They stood just inside the doorway, the snow melting off their coats and dripping onto the floorboards. None of them moved. They just stared. They stared at the clean tables. They stared at the roaring fire. And then their eyes locked onto the massive loaves of steaming bread and the pot of stew. I stood by the stove, my large arms crossed over my chest, an oversized apron tied around my waist. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a sweet, maternal greeting. "Take your muddy boots off before you sit," I commanded, my voice deep and resonant. "And wash your hands in the basin. I didn't spend 4 hours scrubbing this table for you to eat like swine." For a second, I thought they might rebel. They were rough men, but the smell of the food was too much of a weapon. "Yes, ma'am," the older man, Elias, said softly. He pulled off his hat, revealing a bald, liver-spotted head. "Lord Almighty, I think I died and went to heaven." They moved with sudden, frantic energy. Boots were kicked off, hands were plunged into the warm water basin I had prepared, and they scrambled for the benches. I served them myself. I dropped heavy, chipped ceramic bowls in front of them and ladled out massive, generous portions of the thick stew. I placed a whole loaf of bread in the center of the table with a sharp knife and a crock of butter I had managed to salvage and whip back into shape. Silence descended on the room. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers. It was the religious, desperate silence of starving men encountering a miracle. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons, the tearing of crusty bread, and low, involuntary groans of satisfaction. Then the door opened one last time. Silas Thorne filled the frame. He had to duck his head slightly to clear the lintel. The cold radiating off him was palpable, a violent contrast to the sweltering warmth I had built in the room. His ice-colored eyes swept over the scene. The clean floor, the spotless counters, his men eating like they had been starved for a decade. Finally, his gaze landed on me. I didn't shrink under his stare. I met it head-on, my chin raised. I grabbed a clean bowl, filled it to the brim with stew, cut a thick slice of bread, and set it at the head of the table. Silas walked over slowly. His heavy boots thumped against the floorboards, a slow, deliberate rhythm. He sat down. He didn't look at me, nor did he look at his men. He picked up his spoon and took a bite. I watched the muscles in his thick neck swallow. I watched his scarred jaw clench, then relax. He took a piece of the warm bread, dragged it through the thick, smoky broth, and ate it. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a compliment. He just ate, with the slow, methodical focus of a man who suddenly realized how close to the edge he had been living. But when he finished, he scraped his bowl completely clean, not leaving a single drop. When the meal was over, the men practically stumbled out of the cookhouse, their bellies full, their eyes heavy with sleep. Elias paused at the door, tipped his hat to me, and whispered, "God bless you, girl." I was left alone to clean the wreckage. I didn't mind. The physical labor kept my mind quiet. It must have been past midnight when I finally finished. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. I was at the large wooden work table kneading a new batch of dough for tomorrow's breakfast biscuits. The rhythmic push, fold, turn motion was hypnotic. The door unlatched with a soft click. I froze, my hands sinking into the soft dough. Silas stepped inside. He had washed the day's grime from his face, and his dark hair was damp. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying an enormous armful of split cedar wood. He didn't speak. He walked quietly to the hearth and began to stack the wood. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. I noticed immediately that the logs weren't the massive, unwieldy chunks the men usually threw into the fire. Silas had taken the time to split them down, perfectly sized, neat, manageable pieces that would fit perfectly into the firebox of my cast-iron stove. It was an act of service so quiet, so specific to my needs, that it caught in my throat. When he finished stacking, he brushed the wood dust from his forearms and stood up, but he didn't leave. He turned and leaned against the brick wall of the hearth, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He watched me. "You don't have to stay up," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I can manage my own fire." "I know you can," Silas rumbled. His voice was lower now, lacking the harsh bark of the forge. It vibrated in the air. He pushed off the wall and walked slowly toward my work table. I kept kneading the dough, though my heart was suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Because of my size, men usually stood far away from me. They felt threatened or disgusted. But Silas Thorne walked right up to the edge of the table, standing mere inches away. I had to tilt my head up to look at him. His eyes dropped from my face to my hands. My hands were covered in flour, but the scars were impossible to hide. Thick, shiny, puckered ridges of skin crisscrossed the backs of my hands and traveled up my forearms. Souvenirs from grease fires, dropped pots, and a lifetime of being shoved into the hottest, most dangerous corners of kitchens because I was deemed too ugly to be in the dining room. Most people recoiled when they saw my hands. Silas didn't. He stared at the scars, his gaze tracing the lines of them with an intensity that felt almost physical. Slowly he reached out. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. His hand, massive, calloused, scarred from hot iron and freezing wire, hovered over mine. He didn't touch me. He just let his hand rest in the air an inch above my flour-covered knuckles, measuring the size, the strength, the brutal history written on my skin. "They fit," he murmured, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Fit what?" I breathed. Silas finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. The ice in his gaze had melted into something dark, heavy, and profound. "This place," he said simply. He held my gaze for 1 second longer, then dropped his hand, turned, and walked out of the cookhouse into the snowy night, leaving me standing there with flour on my hands and a strange, unfamiliar heat blooming in my chest. The honeymoon period lasted exactly 2 weeks. In that time, I learned the rhythm of ironwood. I learned that Elias liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint, that Silas took his meals in silence but always ate whatever I put in front of him, and that the ranch was bleeding to death. I saw it in the pantry. Every morning I took inventory, and every morning the math became more terrifying. We had 12 men to feed, brutal winter labor requiring massive amounts of calories, and a storage room that was echoing with emptiness. We were down to 1 barrel of salted pork, 2 sacks of dried beans, and a dwindling supply of flour and wheat bran. If I didn't stretch it, the men would starve. If the men starved, they would leave. And if they left, Silas would lose the herd, the ranch, and everything he had built. I had become the beating heart of ironwood survival, rationing every grain of salt and scraping the marrow from every bone to keep the blood flowing. That was why, when Boone walked into my pantry on a Tuesday morning, I nearly killed him. Boone was 22, handsome in a slick, untrustworthy sort of way, and entirely too arrogant for a hand who barely pulled his own weight. I was in the back of the dimly lit storage room, shifting a 50-pound sack of flour to check for mice, when he strolled in. He was looking for a jar of peaches I had explicitly hidden. But what made my blood instantly run cold was the glowing cherry of a cigar clamped between his teeth. The air in the pantry was thick. Because I had been moving sacks, a fine, invisible mist of flour and bran dust hung suspended in the tight, unventilated space. To the untrained eye, it was just dusty air. To a cook who had seen a bakery in St. Louis blow its own roof off, it was a bomb waiting to be lit. "Where are you hiding the sweet stuff, Clem?" Boone asked, taking a deep drag of the cigar. The burning tip flared bright orange. Ash teetered on the edge. I didn't yell. I didn't warn him. Instinct took over. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the prep table beside me and hurled it with all the strength in my broad shoulders. The heavy iron pan spun through the air, missing Boone's face by less than an inch. It smashed into the wooden wall right beside his ear with a deafening crack, splintering the wood and dropping to the floor with a heavy thud. Boone shrieked, a high, undignified sound, and stumbled backward, spitting the cigar from his mouth. It landed on the wooden floorboards, glowing innocently. I crossed the room in 3 massive strides, bringing my heavy boot down on the cigar, crushing it into oblivion. Before Boone could recover his wits, I grabbed him by the collar of his coat, lifted him onto his toes, and slammed him against the wall where the pan had just struck. "Are you out of your God-forsaken mind?" I roared, my face inches from his. "You crazy bitch! You almost took my head off," Boone stammered, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "I should have." I shook him, my massive hands easily overpowering his struggles. "Look around you, you ignorant whelp. Look at the air." He blinked, panicked, staring at the motes of dust dancing in the sliver of light coming through the door. "It's just flour dust. It's kindling," I snarled, dropping him so hard he crumpled to his knees. I stood over him, a mountain of fury. In a closed room with no breeze, dust from bran and flour hangs in the air. Each grain is fuel. You bring an open flame in here and one particle catches. It lights the next, and the next, and the next, faster than a bullet. It's called a dust explosion, Boone. It would have blown the walls off this pantry, incinerated the rest of our food, and roasted us both alive before you could even scream. Boone stared up at me, pale and trembling, finally realizing how close he had come to a fiery death. "If I ever," I whispered, my voice dropping to a lethal calm, "see you with a spark in my kitchen again, I won't throw the pan at the wall. I'll aim for your teeth. Get out." He scrambled to his feet and bolted from the room. I stood there for a long moment, my chest heaving, waiting for the adrenaline to subside. I meticulously swept up the crushed cigar and went back to work. I had bread to bake. But the peace of the morning had been shattered, and it was only going to get worse. Around noon, the sound of a carriage rolling into the yard broke the quiet rhythm of the ranch. It wasn't the heavy, rattling sound of a supply wagon. It was the smooth, jingling approach of fine springs and expensive horses. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked out the small, frosted window of the cookhouse. A sleek black carriage had stopped in the snow. A man stepped out, wearing a tailored wool suit, a heavy fur-lined overcoat, and a bowler hat. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick that he used to fastidiously poke at the snow, as if offended by the dirt beneath it. Thaddeus Vance. Even though I had only been in Oak Haven a few weeks, I knew the name. He was the banker who held the paper on Ironwood. He was the vulture circling Silas's dying beast. I watched as Elias approached him in the yard. They exchanged words. Vance looked dismissive, waving his silver-tipped cane toward the cookhouse. My stomach tightened. A moment later, the heavy oak door of my kitchen swung open without a knock. Thaddeus Vance stepped inside. He didn't remove his hat. He didn't wipe his boots. He brought the cold air and an overwhelming scent of expensive, cloying cologne with him, ruining the smell of my baking bread. He stood in the center of the room, his dark, beady eyes sweeping over the immaculate counters, the roaring fire, and finally settling on me. I stood by the work table, my hands coated in flour, my massive frame rigid. "So," Vance said, his voice slick and oiled, "the rumors in town are true." "Can I help you, Mr. Vance?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I knew who he was. I knew the power he held over Silas. I couldn't afford to throw a pan at this one. Vance stepped deeper into the kitchen. He raised his cane and used the silver tip to poke at a sack of flour resting near my table. The gesture was incredibly invasive, a violation of my space. "I came to inspect my property," Vance said, his lip curling. "Silas Thorne is 3 months behind on his interest payments, which means essentially I own the dirt you're standing on. I own the stove you're cooking on." He turned his gaze back to me, looking me up and down with exaggerated disgust. "Though I must say, I didn't realize Thorne was desperate enough to employ a circus attraction." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. Don't react. Don't give him an excuse. "I'm the cook," I said simply. "You're a beast of burden," Vance corrected cruelly, stepping closer. "Look at the size of you. It's unnatural. A woman should be delicate, refined. You look like you belong hitched to a plow. It's disgraceful that Thorne allows something so grotesque to prepare food for civilized men." My massive hands clenched into fists in the flour. My heart pounded a furious rhythm against my ribs. I had heard these words 1,000 times before from 1,000 different mouths, but here in the kitchen I had saved. They cut deeper. "I think," a voice rumbled from the doorway, "you should step away from her, Vance." The temperature in the room plummeted despite the fire. I looked past Vance. Silas was standing in the doorway. He hadn't made a sound approaching. He just stood there, filling the frame, an absolute monolith of quiet, deadly rage. His ice-blue eyes were locked on Vance, and they were completely devoid of human warmth. Vance stiffened, but he forced a haughty smile, turning to face Silas. "Ah, Thorne. I was just inspecting the premises, making sure my collateral isn't being ruined by—" He waved his cane toward me. "Incompetent, unsightly help." Silas didn't blink. He took one step into the kitchen. It was a slow step, but the sheer predatory menace radiating off him made Vance instinctively take a step back. "You're on my land," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "You walked into my house, and you insulted my cook." "I am the man who holds your debt," Vance snapped, his facade cracking slightly. "You will speak to me with respect, Thorne. I can foreclose on this miserable patch of ice tomorrow if I choose to." "Do it," Silas whispered. He took another step. And then Silas's large, calloused hand dropped slowly toward the leather holster strapped to his thigh. His fingers brushed the wooden grip of his Colt revolver. He wasn't trying to scare Vance. I looked at Silas's face, the tight jaw, the dead eyes, the complete absence of hesitation. He was going to draw. He was going to shoot Thaddeus Vance right between the eyes, right here in my kitchen, and damn the consequences. If he killed the banker, Silas would hang, and Ironwood would be lost by sundown. Silas? No. I didn't think. I moved. I stepped out from behind the work table, crossing the room in 2 massive strides. I reached out and clamped my hand down hard over Silas's right wrist, right as his fingers closed around the grip of the gun. My hand, large and incredibly strong, engulfed his wrist. Flour dusted over the dark sleeve of his shirt. Silas froze. His muscles were corded steel beneath my grip, trembling with the violent urge to draw the weapon. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes wild and dark with murder. "Don't," I said. My voice wasn't a plea, it was an anchor. I squeezed his wrist, letting him feel my strength. letting him know I wasn't a fragile thing that needed him to throw his life away to defend me. He's not worth the dirt on your boots, Silas, and he's not worth losing Ironwood. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither of us breathed. I felt the heat of his skin beneath his shirt. I felt the pulse pounding violently in his wrist. Our eyes were locked, a silent battle of wills between 2 giants. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension drained out of his arm. Silas let go of the gun. He didn't pull his arm away from my grip immediately. He let my hand stay there for a moment longer, grounding him. He turned his gaze back to Vance, who was pale and sweating, having just realized how close he came to dying. "Get off my land," Silas said, his voice flat and final, "before I change my mind." Vance didn't say another word. He practically scrambled backward out the door, his silver-tipped cane clattering against the door frame in his haste. We listened to the frantic sound of boots in the snow, the crack of a whip, and the carriage tearing out of the yard. The cookhouse was silent again, save for the crackling of the fire. I slowly released Silas's wrist, leaving a stark white handprint of flour on his dark sleeve. I stepped back, suddenly hyper-aware of how close we were standing. Silas looked down at the flour mark on his arm, then up at me. His chest heaved once. "He had no right to speak to you that way," Silas said roughly. "I've survived worse words from better men," I replied, turning back to my dough so he wouldn't see my hands shaking. Not from fear of Vance, but from the terrifying realization of what Silas had almost done for me. "You can't shoot every man who calls me ugly, Silas. You'll run out of bullets." Clementine. The way he said my name, the first time he had ever used it, made my hands stop moving. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a low, heavy sound that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. I looked over my shoulder. Silas was still standing there, staring at me with that same dark, profound intensity he had shown the night he brought the wood. "I don't care what they see," Silas said softly. "I see exactly what you are." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He turned and walked back out into the cold, leaving me alone in the sweltering warmth of the kitchen, staring at the flour on my hands, realizing with absolute certainty that I would burn the world down before I let Thaddeus Vance take this ranch from him. The truth about Ironwood Ranch didn't reveal itself in dramatic ledgers or whispered confessions. It revealed itself in the bottom of a flour barrel. 3 days after Thaddeus Vance's visit, the blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world buried in blinding, suffocating white. The silence was absolute, but inside the cookhouse, my mind was roaring. I stood in the center of the cramped pantry, a lantern held high, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I had spent the last 2 hours counting every grain, weighing every slab of salted meat, and cataloging every shriveled root vegetable we had left. The math was a death sentence. When Silas had first hired me, I thought he just wanted a cook who wouldn't poison his men. Now, staring at the empty shelves, I understood the cruel reality of my employment. He hadn't just hired me to cook. He had hired me to perform a miracle. If we fed the dozen men of Ironwood their normal required rations to survive the brutal winter labor, we would run out of food in 3 weeks. But winter would not loosen its grip for at least another 3 months. Vance wasn't just squeezing Silas on the interest payments. He was waiting for the crew to starve. A starving crew would desert. Without a crew, the cattle would die. Without the cattle, Ironwood would default, and Vance would claim the pristine, year-round spring water that flowed beneath Silas's land. Silas Thorne was a giant, but he was drowning, and he had brought me in as his final desperate gasp for air. I didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for delicate women. I tied my apron tighter, grabbed a butcher knife, and went to war. If I had to make stone soup, I would make it taste like a banquet. I started rendering down the tallow, utilizing every scrap of fat I could scrape from the bones. I boiled the marrow. I took to the woods at the edge of the property, my boots sinking waist-deep in the snow, foraging for winter-hardy roots, wild onions, and pine needles to boil into a tea to ward off scurvy. I stretched the flour with dried cornmeal and acorn dust. I didn't say a word to the men, and I didn't say a word to Silas. But he knew. I saw it in the way he watched me at dinner, his eyes tracking the hearty, thick stews I put in front of him, fully aware of the alchemy required to produce it from an empty larder. It was near midnight a week later when I found myself awake. The wind was rattling the window panes of my small room off the kitchen. I couldn't sleep. The cold was seeping into my bones, but it was a deeper restlessness that drove me out of bed. I pulled on my heavy wool coat over my flannel nightgown, wrapped a thick shawl around my head and shoulders, and walked into the dark kitchen. I stirred the banked embers of the stove and warmed a pot of rich, thick bone broth I had been simmering for 2 days. I poured it into a large tin thermos, grabbed a storm lantern, and headed out into the yard. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boots. The sky was terrifyingly clear, a vast ocean of shattered glass stars. I headed straight for the barn. The heavy doors were cracked open. Inside, it smelled of sweet hay, manure, and the sharp metallic tang of blood. I found Silas in the very last stall. A storm lantern hung from a rusty nail, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn timber walls. Silas was on his knees in the straw. He had stripped off his coat and his shirt. His massive torso, covered in a sheen of sweat and mapped with old scars, heaved with exertion. In front of him, a beautiful roan mare was lying on her side, panting heavily, her eyes wide with exhaustion. "She's breech," Silas muttered. He didn't look up, but he knew my heavy footfalls. "The foal's legs are tangled." I didn't ask questions. I set the thermos down, stripped off my coat, and rolled up the sleeves of my nightgown, exposing my thick, scarred arms to the freezing air. I grabbed a bucket of warm water Silas had nearby and a rough cloth. "Tell me what to do," I said. For the next 2 hours, we fought a battle in the dirt and blood. Silas's massive hands, so capable of violence, were incredibly gentle as he worked inside the mare, trying to turn the foal. I held the lantern, stroked the mare's neck, and murmured low, rhythmic assurances to keep her calm. Our shoulders brushed. Our hands slipped in the same water bucket. We worked in a synchronized, desperate rhythm. Finally, with a wet, heavy slide, the foal was born. It was a spindly, shivering thing, but as it took its first ragged breath and let out a weak whinny, the tension in the barn vanished. Silas fell back against the wooden partition of the stall, his massive chest rising and falling. He wiped his bloody forearm across his forehead, leaving a dark streak. I sank down into the clean straw a few feet away, my muscles trembling from the sustained effort. I reached for the tin thermos, poured the steaming bone broth into the metal cap, and held it out to him. He looked at the cup, then up at me. He took it, his large fingers brushing mine. He drank the broth in 3 long, desperate swallows, closing his eyes as the warmth hit his stomach. "You didn't have to come out here," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet barn. The mare was licking her foal, a soft, wet sound. "You didn't have to stay up alone," I replied softly. Silas rested his arms on his drawn-up knees, looking at the empty tin cup. The golden light of the storm lantern flickered over the brutal scar on his face. "I know you saw the pantry," he said quietly. There was no defense in his tone, just a weary surrender. "I know you know what's coming." "I know Vance wants the spring water," I corrected. "And I know I can stretch the oats and the salt pork until the spring thaw. The men won't starve, Silas. I won't let them." Silas turned his head to look at me. His icy blue eyes were entirely stripped of their usual guarded armor. He looked exhausted, burdened by the weight of a dozen lives and a dying legacy. "Why are you doing this, Clementine?" he asked softly. "You could have walked away. When you saw the empty barrels, you should have taken your trunk and found a wealthy household in the city to cook for. You're good enough. Why stay and fight a losing war for a man you barely know?" I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. The lantern light threw the puckered, shiny tissue of my burn scars into sharp relief. "Because St. Louis doesn't want a woman who looks like a mountain," I said, the bitter truth slipping out before I could stop it. Because polite society wants delicate girls who serve tea, not a beast who hauls cast iron. I've been chased out of 3 towns and fired from 4 kitchens because my size offended the sensibilities of the owners' wives. I traced a particularly ugly scar running up my left forearm. "I got this one," I whispered, when a head chef in Kansas City shoved me out of the way of a wealthy patron who wandered into the kitchen. I fell backward into a vat of boiling frying oil. The chef told me I was too clumsy, too big for a professional kitchen. He fired me while my skin was still blistering. The barn was deathly quiet. "You asked why I stay here, Silas?" I finally looked up at him. "Because when I walked into your forge, you didn't look at me like I was a monster. You looked at me like I was a person. And because here in your kitchen, my size isn't a sin. It's the reason I can lift a cauldron of water and keep your men alive. I'm not leaving Ironwood. This is my kitchen now." Silas stared at me. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me I was beautiful because we both knew it would be a lie. Instead, he did something that stopped the breath in my throat. He shifted his massive frame across the straw until he was sitting right beside me. The heat radiating off his bare skin was a physical force against the winter chill. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His large, calloused hand covered mine. His thumb, rough from the anvil, gently traced the jagged, ruined line of the burn scar on my forearm. A jolt of electricity shot up my arm, so intense I nearly gasped. No one touched my scars. People averted their eyes from them. "They aren't ugly," Silas murmured, his voice so low it was almost a vibration against my skin. His thumb continued its slow, reverent path over my ruined flesh. "They're the medals of a survivor. They prove that the fire tried to break you, and it failed." I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying intimacy of his touch. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. Silas lifted his eyes from my arm, meeting my gaze. His face was inches from mine. I could see the gold flecks in his icy blue eyes. I could feel his breath warm against my cheek. "You aren't a beast, Clementine," he whispered fiercely. "You are the strongest, most magnificent goddamn thing I have ever seen." He didn't kiss me. He didn't need to. The slow, burning promise in his eyes, the heavy weight of his hand covering my scars. It was more profound than a kiss. It was a vow. We sat there in the straw as the lantern burned low, 2 scarred giants in the dark, tethered together by the absolute certainty that we would either save Ironwood together or we would burn with it. The fragile peace I had found in the barn lasted exactly 4 days. Then the sabotage began. I walked into the pantry early on a Thursday morning, a wooden scoop in my hand, intending to retrieve a measure of wheat flour for the morning biscuits. The moment I opened the heavy door, a foul metallic scent hit the back of my throat. I raised my lantern. 2 of my 3 remaining barrels of wheat flour, the literal lifeblood of this ranch, were ruined. The lids had been pried off, and someone had dumped gallons of foul, muddy, stagnant water mixed with kerosene directly into the grain. The flour had turned into a toxic gray sludge. I dropped my scoop. The wooden thud echoed in the silence. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. Without that flour, the men couldn't work. The ranch would fold in 2 weeks. Thaddeus Vance had grown tired of waiting for winter to kill us, so he had bought himself a rat inside my kitchen. A cold, lethal fury settled into my chest. I didn't scream. I didn't run to Silas. If Silas found out someone in his own crew had betrayed him, he would tear the man apart with his bare hands. And then he would hang for it. Vance would win. I knelt by the barrels. I examined the floorboards. Amidst the flour dust there was a distinct, fresh boot print, a narrow heel, and a sole caked with a very specific yellow clay. The only place on the ranch with that yellow clay was the south embankment of the creek where Silas had sent Boone to repair a fence line the previous afternoon. Boone. The young, arrogant hand with the sweet tooth and the easily bought morals. I stood up, wiping my hands on my apron. If Boone wanted to play dirty, he was about to learn a very painful lesson. You never, ever go to war with the person who prepares your food. I spent the afternoon baking. I didn't make a scene. I went about my duties with stoic precision. But after the midday meal was cleared, I began my special project. I made a pie. It was a masterpiece. A deep dish wild blackberry pie, using the last of the preserved berries I had hoarded. I made the crust with pure butter, creating a flaky golden lattice that looked like it had been woven by angels. It smelled of cinnamon, sugar, and summer. But beneath the glorious crust, mixed intimately into the sweet bubbling fruit, was a generous handful of crushed cascara sagrada bark and senna root. I had foraged the herbs myself, knowing their medicinal properties. In small doses, they were a mild laxative. In the dose I had just baked into the pie, they were an explosive, violently agonizing purgative that would make a man pray for death. I set the pie on the windowsill of the cookhouse to cool, knowing Boone was on barn duty that afternoon. He was notorious for stealing sweets when my back was turned. I left the kitchen for exactly 15 minutes to chop wood. When I returned, the pie was gone. I smiled, a slow, grim expression, and went back to peeling potatoes. It took 3 hours for the herbs to work their magic. Just after sunset, while the rest of the men were out tending the herd, I took a sharp paring knife and a single red apple and walked out to the barn. I found Boone in an empty horse stall in the back. He was curled into a tight, miserable ball in the hay, clutching his stomach, sweating profusely and groaning in absolute agony. He looked pale as a sheet, his body racked by violent, terrifying cramps. I pulled up a wooden milking stool, sat down just outside the stall, and began to slowly peel the apple. The knife sheared off a perfect, continuous ribbon of red skin. "Stomachache, Boone?" I asked mildly. Boone gasped, rolling onto his back, his eyes wide and terrified. "Clem, I'm dying. I swear to God, my guts are tearing apart. Get help, please." "I don't think you're dying," I said, slicing a piece of the apple and popping it into my mouth. I chewed slowly. "I think you just ate something that didn't agree with you. A blackberry pie, perhaps?" Boone froze, a spasm of pain ripping through him, but this time the terror in his eyes was of a different nature. He looked at the paring knife in my hand, then up at my stone-cold face. "You," he wheezed, doubling over as another cramp hit him. "You poisoned me." "I medicated you," I corrected smoothly. "Cascara bark. It won't kill you, though for the next 12 hours you'll wish it had. It's meant to purge toxins from the body. And right now, Boone, you are a toxin." I leaned forward, dropping the apple and pointing the tip of the knife directly at his pale face. "2 barrels of flour," I growled, my voice vibrating with rage. "You dumped kerosene into the food that keeps your brothers alive. You betrayed the man who puts a roof over your head. Why?" "I didn't!" Boone cried out, but another violent cramp hit him, forcing a pathetic sob from his throat. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, standing up, my massive frame towering over him. "I saw your boot prints in the yellow clay. I know it was you. You tell me the truth right now, or I will lock this stall door, walk away, and let you evacuate your bowels until you pass out in your own filth." All right, Boone sobbed, clutching his stomach, tears streaming down his face. "It was Vance. He cornered me in town last week, said Ironwood was going under anyway. He gave me $50. Said if the flour was ruined, the men would quit, and Silas would have to sell. He said nobody would get hurt." "Nobody would get hurt," I scoffed, disgusted. "We would freeze and starve, you idiot." "What the hell is going on here?" The voice boomed through the barn like thunder. I turned. Silas was standing at the end of the aisle. The lantern light caught the murderous glint in his eyes. He had heard enough. Silas closed the distance in huge, terrifying strides. He bypassed me completely, reaching into the stall. His massive hand locked onto the front of Boone's shirt, and with one effortless heave, he dragged the young man out of the hay and slammed him against the wooden post. Boone screamed, a pathetic, broken sound. "You sold me out for $50? Silas roared, his free hand curling into a fist the size of a ham. "I took you in when you were a stray. I fed you." Silas pulled his arm back. A punch with that much force and fury behind it would snap Boone's neck. "Silas, stop!" I lunged forward, throwing my entire weight against his arm. The impact jarred him, throwing off his aim. His fist slammed into the wooden post inches from Boone's head, splintering the timber. "Get off me, Clem," Silas snarled, his eyes completely feral. "He's a traitor. Out here, traitors swing." "He's a stupid, greedy boy," I yelled back, refusing to let go of his arm. "If you kill him, Vance wins. Vance wants you to do something rash so the sheriff can arrest you. That's why he bought a weak link." Silas breathed heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes burning into Boone, who was weeping openly now, terrified of Silas and ravaged by the pie. "A dead man can't shovel snow, Silas," I said, my voice dropping, reasoning with the giant. "A dead man can't muck out the stalls or repair the southern fence line. We are short-handed and out of food. We cannot afford to lose a body, even a treacherous one." Silas stared at me, his jaw clenching so hard I thought his teeth would crack. Slowly, the murderous red haze faded from his eyes. He dropped Boone, letting the young man collapse into a pathetic heap on the dirt floor. Silas looked down at him with utter revulsion. "You give the $50 to Clem to buy back whatever flour she can," Silas said, his voice cold and hollow. "You surrender your rifle and your horse. From this moment on, you don't earn a wage, you work for your life. You eat the scraps, you sleep in the tack room, and you do the hardest, most brutal labor on this ranch. When the debt for the flour is paid, I will beat you within an inch of your life, and then you will walk away from Ironwood and never come back. Do you understand?" Boone nodded frantically, curling into a ball as another wave of stomach cramps hit him. "Yes. Yes, boss. I swear." Silas didn't look at him again. He turned his gaze to me. He looked at the paring knife still in my hand, then toward the cookhouse. "Did you poison him?" Silas asked, a faint, almost imperceptible sliver of amusement breaking through his rage. "I made him a pie," I said primly, sliding the knife into my apron pocket. "He just lacked the constitution for it." Silas shook his head slowly, letting out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He stepped closer to me, oblivious to Boone groaning on the floor. "Remind me never to cross you, Clementine," he murmured. "You won't have to," I replied, meeting his gaze. "Because unlike him, you know I'm the one keeping you alive." I turned and walked out of the barn, leaving the traitor to his misery, and the giant rancher staring after me with a look that made the winter night feel suddenly intensely warm. Spring did not arrive in Oak Haven with a gentle thaw. It arrived with brutal, knee-deep mud and a desperate, gnawing hunger. Boone's $50 had bought us exactly enough time to survive the final, agonizing weeks of winter, but it wasn't enough to secure the future. Ironwood was bled dry. We needed seed for the spring planting, medicine for the calving heifers, and wages for the men who had stayed loyal through the bitter cold. We needed money that didn't exist. The Oak Haven County Fair was the first gathering of the season, a desperate attempt by the locals to celebrate their survival. And more importantly, it hosted the annual agricultural and culinary exhibition. The grand prize for the baking competition was $200, a small fortune. It was enough to buy the seed. It was enough to save the ranch. "You don't have to do this," Silas had told me the night before, watching me pack my heavy wooden crates with my best flour, rare spices I had hoarded, and jars of preserved apples. "The town won't be kind." "I don't need them to be kind," I had replied, not looking up from my work. "I need their $200. The fairgrounds were a sprawling, muddy mess of canvas tents, livestock pens, and desperate, shivering people pretending to be cheerful. When Silas drove our wagon through the gates, the chatter around us died down. I sat tall on the buckboard next to him. I was wearing my best dress, a dark, heavy wool garment that did nothing to hide the sheer, massive breadth of my shoulders. Next to me, Silas looked like a mountain carved from granite. Together, we were a terrifying, imposing sight. When I carried my heavy crates into the main exhibition tent, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The tent was filled with the delicate, pastel-clad wives of Oakhaven's merchants and bankers. They were small, bird-like women with unblemished hands, arranging dainty little tarts and pale, uninspired sponge cakes on lace doilies. When I set my scarred, iron-banded chest down on my assigned wooden table, the heavy thud made the delicate china on the next table rattle. "Good heavens," Mrs. Higgins, the mayor's wife, gasped, fluttering a gloved hand to her chest. She looked at me as if a bear had just wandered into her parlor. "Is she actually competing?" "Probably making a trough of gruel," another woman whispered loudly, snickering. I ignored them. I tied my heavy canvas apron around my waist, unrolled my leather case of knives, and went to work. I had 4 hours to bake on the cast-iron stoves provided at the back of the tent. I didn't make a dainty sponge cake. I made a declaration of war. I baked a towering, 4-tiered spiced apple and honey cake. It was a recipe born of necessity and refined by years of hard labor. The cake was dense, rich, and dark, infused with cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, layered with a sharp, sweet apple compote that I had reduced over the fire until it was like liquid amber. But the true masterpiece was the decoration. People think that because my hands are the size of a man's, they are clumsy. They don't understand that strength allows for absolute, unwavering control. I melted raw sugar in a copper pot until it reached the exact perilous temperature between liquid and burnt. Then, using a whisk, I flicked the molten sugar over a greased wooden dowel, drawing it out into threads as fine as spider silk. I worked with relentless, hypnotic precision. The society women slowly stopped their gossiping and began to stare. By the time the judges arrived, my cake stood in the center of my crude wooden table. It was a dark, magnificent monolith, crowned with a towering, intricate halo of spun golden sugar that caught the light like a crown of glass. The head judge was a traveling culinary critic from Denver, brought in to ensure fairness. He was a small, fussy man with a monocle. He tasted Mrs. Higgins' lemon tart and smiled politely. He tasted the banker's wife's pound cake and nodded. Then he reached my table. He looked up at me, a giant, sweating woman with burn scars crisscrossing her forearms, and then down at the fragile, breathtaking spun sugar crown. He took a knife, cut a sliver of the cake, and placed it in his mouth. I watched his throat swallow. His eyes widened, completely shocked by the explosion of complex, perfectly balanced flavors. The sharp bite of the spice, the mellow depth of the honey, the tartness of the apple. He didn't say a word. He just took his pen and wrote on his clipboard. An hour later, the crowd gathered in the center of the tent for the announcements. Silas stood at the back, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes locked on me. Elias and the rest of the Ironwood crew were there too, standing together like a wall of rough, unwashed loyalty. "First prize," the judge announced, his voice ringing out over the murmuring crowd. "And the grand sum of $200 goes to Miss Clementine Miller of Ironwood Ranch for an absolutely peerless spiced honey cake." The Ironwood crew erupted into deafening cheers. Elias threw his hat into the air. The rest of the tent was dead silent. The society women stared in horrified disbelief. I felt a surge of fierce, undeniable pride. I walked forward to claim the small velvet pouch of gold coins and the blue ribbon. "Wait just a damn minute!" The voice cut through the tent like a whip. The crowd parted, and Thaddeus Vance strode into the center of the room. He was dressed in a pristine gray suit, his face mottled with ugly, venomous rage. "This is a farce!" Vance shouted, pointing his silver-tipped cane at me. "You're going to award the grand prize of Oakhaven to this creature? To a woman who lives in a cabin full of unwashed men?" The crowd gasped. The judge looked taken aback. "Mr. Vance, the competition is judged purely on culinary merit." "Culinary merit," Vance sneered, turning to the crowd. He knew he was losing Ironwood, and in his desperation, he wanted to destroy the morale of the man who had beaten him. And the easiest way to hurt Silas was to humiliate me. Vance stepped closer to me, his eyes sweeping over my massive frame with theatrical disgust. "Look at her. Look at the size of her shoulders. Look at those hideous scarred hands. She's an abomination, a freak of nature. She doesn't belong in a civilized town, and she certainly doesn't belong on a winner's podium." The words hit me like physical blows. Every insecurity, every cruel taunt I had ever endured since I was a child came rushing back. The pride I felt seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow shame. I felt my face burn, my chest tightening so hard I couldn't breathe. The entire town was staring at me. Some looked pitying, but many looked disgusted. I lowered my head, my massive shoulders hunching, instinctively trying to make myself smaller, trying to disappear. But before I could take a step back, the light shifted. A massive shadow fell over me, completely blocking Thaddeus Vance from my view. Silas Thorne had crossed the tent so fast it was a blur. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't give Vance the legal excuse he was begging for. Instead, Silas stepped directly in front of me, placing his towering broad back to the crowd, effectively shielding me from every single cruel eye in the tent. "Silas!" Vance spat, taking a nervous step back from the giant. "You can't protect this." "Shut your mouth, Vance." Silas's voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, seismic rumble that carried through the silent tent, vibrating with a lethal, suppressed violence. "If you speak another word to her, if you even look at her again, I will forget the law. I will break you in half." Vance swallowed hard, his face paling. He looked at Silas's fists, clenched so tight the knuckles were white, and he backed away, melting into the crowd. Silas didn't look at Vance. He turned his back on the banker, turned his back on the mayor, and turned his back on the entire town of Oakhaven. He looked only at me. His icy blue eyes swept over my hunched posture, my trembling hands. Slowly, deliberately in front of the entire scandalized town, Silas reached out. His large hands grasped my broad shoulders, and with a gentle, firm pressure, he pulled me upright. He made me stand tall. He didn't say a word. He reached over, snatched the velvet pouch of coins and the blue ribbon from the judge's paralyzed hand, and pressed them into my scarred palms. Then he placed a heavy, protective hand on the small of my back and walked me out of the tent. The crowd parted for us like the Red Sea. We walked out into the freezing spring mud, the giant and his monstrous cook, leaving the fragile, beautiful people of Oakhaven choking on their own malice. The wagon ride back to Ironwood was suffocatingly silent. The blue ribbon sat in my lap, mocking me. The $200 in gold felt like lead. We had won the money to save the ranch, but Vance had achieved exactly what he wanted. He had stripped me bare in front of the world. He had reminded me that no matter how brilliantly I cooked, no matter how hard I worked, I would never be anything more than a grotesque oddity. When we finally reached the ranch, I didn't wait for Silas to help me down. I jumped from the buckboard, my heavy boots hitting the slush, and practically ran toward the cookhouse. I bolted the heavy oak door behind me. The kitchen was cold, the fire having died down during our absence. It matched the ice in my chest. I didn't light a lantern. I walked straight to my small, cramped bedroom off the pantry and dragged my battered wooden trunk from beneath the cot. I opened it and began throwing my meager possessions inside. 2 wool dresses, a spare apron, a worn comb. Then I walked into the dark kitchen and unrolled my leather knife case. I took my favorite chef's knife, the one I'd pointed at Silas on the day we met, and stared at the blade. A tear, hot and heavy, slipped down my cheek, landing on the polished steel with a soft ping. I wiped my face angrily. "Don't cry. You knew what you were. You always knew." A heavy knock rattled the cookhouse door. "Clem," Silas's voice. "Go away," I called out, my voice thick and hoarse. The handle jiggled. When he found it locked, there was a moment of silence. Then a massive, terrifying crack echoed through the room. The iron bolt tore free from the wooden frame as Silas kicked the door open. He stepped into the kitchen, the wind howling behind him. He closed the broken door, pushing it shut against the draft. He looked at my open leather knife case on the table. He looked at my packed trunk visible through the open bedroom door. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was low, tight, dangerously calm. "I'm packing," I said, not looking at him. I aggressively slid my knife into its leather slot. "You have the $200. You can buy the seed. You can pay Elias and the men. Ironwood is safe. Vance has no leverage left." "I asked what you are doing," Silas repeated, closing the distance between us. "I am leaving," I finally snapped, spinning around to face him. The tears I had fought so hard to hold back were spilling over now, hot and humiliating. "I'm leaving before I ruin anything else." Silas stopped a few feet away, his brow furrowing deeply. "Ruin? You just saved this ranch. You saved all of us. And what did it cost you?" I cried, my voice breaking. "Vance is right, Silas. Look at me." I threw my arms out, gesturing to my massive, broad body, my heavily muscled shoulders. "I am an embarrassment. I am a freak. The men respect me because I feed them. But the rest of the world, the town, they will never stop mocking you for keeping a monster in your house." "I don't give a damn about the town," Silas roared, the sudden, violent volume of his voice shaking the pans hanging from the ceiling. "Well, I do," I shouted back, stepping toward him, the pain of a lifetime of rejection bleeding out of me. "I am tired of the whispers, Silas. I am tired of the disgust. You are a respectable man. You saved your ranch. Now you need a respectable wife, someone delicate, someone who won't make people stare and whisper when you walk into town." I took a trembling breath, staring up at the giant man with the scarred face, the man who had unknowingly become the center of my entire world. I had to say it. I had to rip the bandage off before the hope festering in my chest destroyed me entirely. "I don't blame you, Silas," I whispered, the fight draining out of me, leaving only a hollow, crushing ache. "I understand. I'm too big to be loved. But I can cook. You have the prize money to prove it. Now, please, just let me go." I turned away, reaching for my knife roll to finish packing. I never touched it. A massive hand gripped my shoulder and spun me back around. Before I could process what was happening, Silas surged forward. His heavy boots backed me up until my spine hit the edge of the wooden work table, trapping me between the solid oak and his towering, unyielding body. He didn't give me an inch to retreat. The heat radiating off him was overwhelming. "Don't you ever," Silas ground out, his face inches from mine, his icy eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. "Say that again. Do you hear me? Don't you ever say you are unlovable." I stared at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, trapped by the intensity of his gaze. Silas reached into the inside pocket of his heavy wool coat. He pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment and slammed it down onto the wooden table beside us with a loud smack. I looked down. It was an official document stamped by the county clerk. Marriage license. My name, Clementine Miller, was already written on it in dark, bold ink. I gasped, looking from the paper back to his face. "Silas, what is this?" "I had it drawn up while you were baking that cake," Silas said, his voice dropping to a rough, ragged whisper. His massive chest heaved, brushing against mine. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to my core. "I was waiting to give it to you tonight, before Vance ruined it." "But why?" I breathed, my mind spinning. "To protect the ranch? A legal defense against Vance?" "Damn the ranch," Silas swore, his hands coming up to grip my face. His large, calloused thumbs traced the line of my jaw, incredibly gentle for a man who could bend iron bars. "I don't want a delicate wife, Clem. I don't want a fragile porcelain doll who snaps at the first sign of winter. I want you." He stepped even closer, pressing his massive frame fully against mine. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel monstrous. Against his sheer size, against the immovable strength of his body, I felt protected. I felt like a woman. "You think you're too big?" Silas whispered, his gaze dropping to my lips. You think you take up too much space? Good. Because a man like me needs a woman who can stand her ground in the fire. Well, he slid his hands down from my face, his fingers trailing over my broad shoulders, down my thick arms until his hands completely engulfed my scarred, flour-dusted hands. He lifted them, pressing my palms flat against the heavy, thundering beat of his heart beneath his shirt. "You aren't a hired cook, Clementine," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that tore at my soul. "You are the reason this place survived. You are the reason I survived. Sign that paper. Become the mistress of Ironwood. Become my wife." Tears blurred my vision, but these weren't tears of shame. They were tears of profound, terrifying joy. "Silas," I sobbed, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt. "Are you sure?" "Let me show you," he murmured, his eyes darkening with a raw, long-denied hunger. "Exactly how perfectly you fit in my arms." He didn't wait for an answer. Silas lowered his head and captured my lips with his. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was an explosion. It was the violent collision of two isolated, scarred giants who had finally found the one person in the world who could match their strength. I opened my mouth to him with a desperate answering hunger, sliding my thick arms around his massive neck, pulling him closer. His arms wrapped around my waist, lifting me effortlessly until my boots left the floor, sitting me on the edge of the wooden work table. He crowded between my thighs, pulling me flush against his hard, burning body. I felt the desperate grip of his hands in my hair, the rough stubble of his scarred cheek rasping against mine. Every cruelty, every insult, every lonely, freezing night I had ever endured was burned away in the heat of his mouth. He kissed me like I was a starving man's first meal, like I was the most beautiful, precious thing he had ever held. When we finally broke apart, we were both gasping for air. Our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the cold kitchen. Silas reached blindly for the table, grabbed a charcoal pencil, and pressed it into my hand. I didn't hesitate. I bent over the parchment and signed my name. Silas looked at the signature, a slow, triumphant smile breaking through his normally stoic face. He looked at me, his eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "You're mine now, Clementine Thorne," he whispered, pulling me back into his chest. "And if the town of Oakhaven has a problem with the size of my wife, they can take it up with my gun." I buried my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of wood smoke, horses, and the man who had just given me the entire world. For the first time in my life, I took up exactly the right amount of space. We were married the very next morning, right in the center of my kitchen. There was no lace gown, no organ music, and certainly no respectable society women in attendance. I wore my best dark wool dress, dusted faintly with flour at the hem. Silas wore a clean chambray shirt, his hair slicked back, the brutal scar on his face doing nothing to diminish the rugged, overwhelming, handsome features of his face. A circuit judge, a nervous little man passing through on his way to Denver, performed the ceremony. The congregation consisted of Elias, Boone, and the rest of the Ironwood crew who had crowded into the cookhouse, their hats clutched in their rough hands, beaming like proud fathers. When the judge pronounced us man and wife, Silas didn't politely kiss my cheek. He wrapped his massive arms around my waist, hauled me flush against his solid chest, and kissed me until my head spun, and the crew erupted into deafening cheers and wolf whistles. Our honeymoon was exactly one night long, but it was a night that remade me from the inside out. In the quiet, dark sanctuary of Silas's bedroom, the howling wind outside faded away. For 26 years, I had been told my body was a burden, a grotesque overabundance of flesh and muscle. But under the golden light of a single oil lamp, Silas Thorne dismantled a lifetime of shame with his bare hands. He didn't treat me like I was fragile, because I wasn't. But he treated me like I was precious. His massive, calloused hands mapped every inch of my broad shoulders, the thick curve of my hips, the scarred, heavy strength of my arms. Where I saw bulk, he saw beauty. Where I saw ugly, puckered burns, His lips followed the ridges of my skin like they were tracing holy scripture. "Perfect," he rasped against the crook of my neck, his heavy body pressing me into the mattress, making me feel surrounded, anchored, and entirely consumed. "You are absolutely perfect." By the time the sun rose, casting a pale, icy light over the snowy plains, I was no longer the outcast cook of Oakhaven. I was Clementine Thorne, and I was ready to defend my home. Thaddeus Vance did not take his public humiliation at the fair lightly. If he couldn't break Silas with debt and he couldn't shame us out of town, he was going to starve us out by force. 3 days after the wedding, Elias rode back from the property line, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with fury. "They've barricaded the main access road," Elias reported, bursting into the cookhouse where Silas and I were drinking our morning coffee. "Vance hired a dozen Pinkertons and local thugs. They've strung barbed wire across the gorge and set up an armed camp. Anyone trying to move a supply wagon or a herd through is getting shot." Silas set his tin cup down, his jaw locked, the muscles ticking beneath his scarred cheek. "What about the Eastern Ridge?" "Blocked too," Elias spat. "They're choking us off. We can't get the cattle to the railhead to sell, and we can't get seed or supplies in. It's a siege, boss." The warmth of the kitchen suddenly felt like a trap. A siege meant a war of attrition. Vance had the money to pay his thugs indefinitely. We had $200 of prize money that was utterly useless if we couldn't reach a town to spend it. Silas stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. He walked to the gun cabinet in the corner and pulled out his Winchester repeating rifle. "Saddle the horses," Silas ordered Elias, his voice deadly calm. "Tell the men to arm themselves. We're going to the gorge." "Silas," I said, my heart jumping into my throat, "if you fire on them, Vance will bring the federal marshals down on you. He's baiting you into a gunfight on your own land." Silas turned to me, his eyes softening just a fraction, though the lethal intent remained. "I know, Clem, but I won't let a suited coward build a cage around my wife and my men. We hold the line. We make sure they don't advance an inch past the gorge. If we show weakness now, they'll ride right into the yard." Splendid. For the next week, Ironwood turned into a military encampment. Silas and the men dug trenches and built fortified barricades out of felled timber and sandbags at the edge of the gorge, staring down Vance's armed thugs just 100 yards away. The spring air was bitterly cold, the mud freezing solid at night. It was a miserable, nerve-wracking standoff. Shots were fired into the air, taunts were yelled across the barbed wire, but neither side committed to a full slaughter. Yet. I refused to sit in the main house and wring my hands. I was the mistress of Ironwood, and my men were freezing on the front lines. I turned the kitchen into an engine of war. I baked massive, dense loaves of bread, roasted the salted pork until it was falling apart, and brewed gallons of coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Every afternoon, as the sun began to dip and the temperature plummeted, I loaded a heavy wooden sled with cast-iron cauldrons of boiling stew and insulated jugs of coffee. I didn't let the men fetch it. I hauled it myself. I strapped the leather harness of the sled across my broad chest and dragged 300 pounds of food and iron through the snow and mud, marching the 2 miles from the homestead to the gorge. The physical labor was grueling, my muscles burning, my boots sinking deep into the muck. But I didn't stop. When I crested the ridge and dragged the sled into the trench, the men looked at me like I was an avenging angel. "Lord Almighty, Mrs. Thorne," Tom, one of the younger hands, practically wept as I handed him a steaming tin bowl of thick, meat-laden stew. I was about to eat my own boots. Silas was leaning against the barricade, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He looked exhausted, his face smeared with dirt, but when he saw me, the tension drained from his shoulders. I walked over to him, carrying an oversized bowl and a mug of black coffee. He took the bowl, but before he ate, he caught my chin in his free hand and kissed me, hard, tasting of gunpowder, cold air, and desperate affection. "You shouldn't be out here in the open, Clem," he murmured, his eyes scanning the tree line across the gorge where Vance's men were camped. "A soldier can't fight on an empty stomach," I replied, wiping a smudge of dirt from his scarred cheek. "And neither can my husband. Mrs. Thorne?" I turned. Boone was standing a few feet away. He looked ragged, shivering in a coat that was too thin for the weather. Since the day in the barn, he had worked like a demon, taking the worst shifts, doing the heaviest lifting, speaking only when spoken to. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at me, pointing to the heavy, empty cast-iron cauldrons on the sled. "Let me haul the sled back to the house for you, ma'am," Boone said quietly, his eyes fixed on the mud. "It's too heavy a pull uphill. I can take it." Silas's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on his rifle. He hadn't forgiven the boy. But I looked at Boone, seeing the genuine remorse in his shivering frame. I nodded. "All right, Boone. Wash the pots with boiling water when you get them to the kitchen. Then come back and get your bowl of stew." Boone looked up, swallowing hard. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." He grabbed the heavy leather harness, straining against the weight, and began the long trek back to the house. I watched him go, feeling Silas's eyes on me. "You're too forgiving," Silas rumbled. "I'm practical," I corrected, leaning my heavy frame against his solid side. "A hungry dog bites. A fed dog guards the house. Boone owes me his life, and he knows it." We stood together in the freezing trench, watching the smoke from the enemy camp drift into the gray sky. We were holding the line, but we were running out of time. Vance was a coward, and cowards didn't fight fair. He wasn't going to sit across the gorge forever. He was going to try and burn us out, and the match was already lit. The attack didn't come with a battle cry. It came in the dead of a moonless night, cloaked in silence and the smell of sulfur. I was asleep in our bed, wrapped securely in Silas's massive arms, when the frantic hammering on the front door jolted us awake. Silas was out of bed and had his revolver cocked before my eyes were fully open. "Boss! Boss! Open up!" It was Boone. His voice was cracked with panic. Silas threw the deadbolt and yanked the door open. Boone fell into the hallway, gasping for air, his face pale and smeared with mud. "They bypassed the gorge," Boone wheezed, pointing frantically toward the southern pasture. "Vance's men, 6 of them. They slipped through the creek bed. They're headed for the old feed barn right next to the main herd." "If they steal the cattle, we track them at dawn," Silas growled, pulling on his boots and tossing a spare rifle to Boone. "They ain't stealing them, Silas," Boone shouted, sheer terror in his eyes. "I heard them talking in the brush. They brought dynamite and pitch torches. They're going to spook the herd. 2,000 head of cattle, boss. They're going to stampede them straight through the yard. They're going to trample the house, the cookhouse, everything. We'll be crushed in our beds." My blood ran ice cold. A stampede of that size, driven by explosions and fire, was a force of nature. It would flatten the timber house like a house of cards. It would turn Silas, myself, and the men sleeping in the bunkhouse into a bloody smear in the mud. And Vance could claim it was a tragic natural disaster. "Wake the men!" Silas roared to Boone. "Get everyone to the high ground behind the rocks. Go!" Silas turned to me, grabbing my shoulders. "Clem, you get up the ridge, now." "What are you going to do?" I demanded, grabbing my heavy coat. "I have to turn the herd," Silas said, his eyes wild. "If I can get on horseback and fire off a few rounds to the east, I might be able to redirect the vanguard before they hit the house." "It's too dark, Silas. There are too many. You'll be trampled." "I have to try." He kissed me, hard and desperate. "Go!" He bolted out the door into the pitch-black night. I stood in the hallway, my heart hammering a violent rhythm. The roar of the wind outside was suddenly drowned out by a low, terrifying rumble. The earth beneath my boots began to vibrate. The herd was waking up. They were restless. I ran to the kitchen window and looked toward the old feed barn, which sat on a slight incline directly between the massive herd of cattle and our homestead. It acted as a funnel. Through the darkness, I saw the faint, flickering orange glow of a match, then another. Vance's men were inside the open-ended breezeway of the feed barn, lighting their pitch torches. In seconds, they would throw the dynamite, wave the fire, and send 2,000 tons of panicked beef thundering directly toward my kitchen. There was no time to shoot them. There was no time to ride out. But as I stared at the dark silhouette of the feed barn, a memory clicked into place like the hammer of a gun. The loft. The feed barn loft was packed to the ceiling with massive 100-pound burlap sacks of dry wheat bran, oat dust, and stale flour that we had deemed unfit for human consumption. It was a suspended ocean of highly combustible particulate. In a closed room with no breeze, dust from bran and flour hangs in the air. It lights faster than a bullet. I didn't run for the ridge. I grabbed my sharpest, heaviest butcher knife from the block, threw open the kitchen door, and sprinted straight into the darkness toward the feed barn. The vibration in the ground was growing stronger. The cattle were lowing, a deep, panicked sound. I moved with a speed that defied my massive size, my heavy boots eating up the distance. I didn't care about the noise I made. The wind and the restless herd masked my approach. I reached the back of the feed barn. I grabbed the rungs of the wooden ladder leading up to the loft and hauled my heavy frame upward. My muscles screamed, but adrenaline fueled me. I rolled over the lip of the loft into total darkness. Below me, through the wide gaps in the floorboards, I could see them. 6 men. They had soaked rags wrapped around thick branches, dripping with kerosene. One man was holding a bundle of dynamite sticks, a lit cigar clamped in his teeth, preparing to light the fuse. "Light the torches," the leader hissed. "Soon as they're blazing, throw the sticks at the cows' feet and run like hell." I didn't breathe. I crawled silently across the loft floor until I was positioned directly over the center aisle, right above their heads. Stacked around me were dozens of massive sacks of fine bran and flour. I gripped my butcher knife. I took a deep breath, anchoring my boots against a support beam. With one brutal sweeping motion of my massive arm, I slashed the bottom of the first sack, then the second, then the third. I kicked the slashed sacks over the edge of the loft opening. Hundreds of pounds of fine, bone-dry flour and bran dust cascaded downward like a violent, silent avalanche. It hit the floor of the breezeway below and instantly exploded outward, filling the enclosed, windless corridor of the barn with a thick, choking, blinding white cloud. "What the hell is this?" one of the thugs yelled, coughing violently as the dust coated his lungs and blinded his eyes. "The roof caving in?" "I can't see," another shouted. Up in the loft, I threw myself backward, diving behind a solid, thick structural beam of the barn. I curled my massive body into a tight ball, covered my head with my arms, and opened my mouth to keep my eardrums from bursting. Down below, suspended in the thick, aerosolized cloud of highly combustible dust, the leader of the thugs spat out his cigar to yell an order and simultaneously struck a sulfur match against the wooden wall to light his torch. The spark caught the dust particle nearest to it. That particle ignited the next and the next, in a microscopic chain reaction that traveled at the speed of sound. Time seemed to slow down to an excruciating crawl. The air inside the barn didn't just catch fire, it detonated. Boom! The sound was apocalyptic. The shockwave hit me like a physical blow, rattling my teeth in my skull and lifting me an inch off the floorboards. A blinding, localized sun flared into existence beneath me. The physics of a dust explosion are brutal. Because it happened in the enclosed breezeway, the explosive force had only 2 ways to go, out the front and out the back. A colossal, roaring wall of pure, blinding fire shot out of the barn doors like a dragon's breath. The concussion wave blasted the 6 thugs completely off their feet, throwing them out into the mud, their clothes singed, their eardrums blown, entirely incapacitated by the concussive force. But the true miracle was the cattle. The massive wall of fire and the deafening explosion erupted directly in front of the herd. To a cow, fire means death. The panicked, surging mass of 2,000 animals, which had been preparing to stampede forward, was met with a terrifying, impenetrable firewall. In a chaotic, thunderous wave, the entire herd slammed on the brakes. Driven by primal terror of the flames, they violently swerved. Like a river hitting a dam, the stampede turned sharply to the east, thundering away from the homestead, away from the barricades, and out into the open plains. The ground shook for 5 solid minutes as they ran, but the sound was fading. They were going away. In the loft, my ears were ringing violently. The air smelled of burnt toast and ozone. Small, harmless embers drifted through the air like fireflies. I slowly uncurled my massive body. I was covered head to toe in white flour, looking like a terrifying ghost. I crawled to the edge of the loft and looked down. The thugs were groaning in the mud, entirely neutralized. No shots fired, no casualties, just 6 deafened, terrified men who had picked a fight with a baker. Suddenly I heard the frantic, desperate sound of a horse galloping into the yard. "Clem!" Silas's voice tore through the ringing in my ears. It was a sound of absolute raw terror. He threw himself off his horse before it even stopped moving, his rifle in hand, staring at the smoking, charred entrance of the feed barn. He thought I was in the house. He thought the explosion had been the dynamite. I stood up. I walked to the edge of the loft opening, silhouetted against the moonlight. A giant woman covered in white dust, holding a butcher knife. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locked on me. His chest was heaving, his face pale beneath the dirt and shadows. "I told you," I called down to him, my voice raspy but echoing in the sudden quiet of the night. "Dust catches fast." Silas dropped his rifle into the mud. He didn't say a word. He just stared up at me, the terror in his eyes melting into a look of such profound, overwhelming awe that it stole the breath from my lungs. Vance had sent fire and fury to destroy us, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who controlled the fire. The silence that followed the explosion was the loudest sound I had ever heard, as the dust settled and the ringing in my ears faded into a dull hum. Silas scrambled up the wooden ladder of the loft. He didn't care about the splintering wood or the lingering smoke. When he reached the top, he lunged across the floorboards, grabbing my flour-covered body and pulling me into a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in my neck, his massive frame shaking violently. He didn't speak. He just breathed me in, grounding himself in the reality that I was alive, solid, and safe in his arms. Down below, the Ironwood crew arrived with lanterns and drawn rifles. They found Vance's 6 thugs groaning in the mud, their hair singed, their faces blackened by soot, entirely deafened and disoriented. Beside them, pristine and damning, lay a satchel full of unlit dynamite and a wad of banknotes banded with the seal of the Oakhaven First National Bank. Boone was the one who tied the knots, securing their wrists with vicious, unapologetic tight loops. "Sing," Silas commanded, climbing down from the loft with me right beside him. His voice was cold enough to freeze the blood in their veins. Terrified of the giant rancher and the flower demon who had just dropped a wall of fire on them, the leader of the thugs broke before Silas even cocked his rifle. He confessed everything. Vance had paid them $500 to stampede the herd, destroy the homestead, and make sure there were no survivors. We didn't wait for the sun to rise. At daybreak, the town of Oakhaven woke to the thunder of hooves. Silas, Elias, myself, and the entire Ironwood crew rode down Main Street in a tight, heavily armed formation. Trailing behind Silas's horse, bound together by a long rope, were the 6 soot-covered thugs. We stopped directly in front of the bank. Thaddeus Vance stepped out onto the boardwalk, a cup of morning coffee in his hand, dressed in his pristine gray suit. When he saw his hired killers tied up like livestock and the unexploded dynamite slung over Silas's saddle horn, the color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. The townspeople began to gather, stepping out of their shops and boarding houses, whispering and pointing. "Sheriff!" Silas roared, his voice bouncing off the wooden facades of the buildings. The local sheriff, a man who had long turned a blind eye to Vance's cruelty, scurried out of his office, looking nervously at the armed Ironwood crew. Silas tossed the satchel of dynamite at the sheriff's feet. It landed with a heavy, terrifying thud in the dirt. Then Silas tossed the banded stack of banknotes right beside it. "Attempted murder, arson, destruction of property," Silas announced, his voice carrying to every ear on the street. He pointed a calloused finger at the trembling thugs. "They've already confessed, and they have a lot to say about the man who signed those banknotes." Vance puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his crumbling empire. This is an outrage. These men are liars, thugs. You cannot take the word of criminals over a pillar of this community. They won't have to, a crisp, authoritative voice interrupted. A man pushed through the crowd, flashing a silver badge pinned to his lapel. A United States Marshal passing through from Denver, drawn by the commotion. He looked at the dynamite, the banknotes, and then at Vance. "Thaddeus Vance," the Marshal said, pulling a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his belt. "I've been looking into the rather aggressive foreclosure practices of this bank for 3 months. I think it's time we had a long talk about conspiracy." As the Marshal clamped the irons onto Vance's wrists, the banker lost his mind. His pristine facade shattered completely. He thrashed, his eyes finding me sitting tall on the wagon seat. "You!" Vance spat, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. "This is because of you, you grotesque freak! You ruined everything!" I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I sat up straighter, letting my broad shoulders span as wide as they naturally were. "No, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice deep, calm, and ringing with absolute authority. "I just baked the bread. You ruined yourself." The townspeople, the same fragile women who had mocked me at the fair, stared in stunned silence. But this time I didn't care about their stares. Silas rode his massive black stallion up beside my wagon. He reached out in front of the entire town, took my scarred, flour-dusted hand, and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. "Let's go home, Mrs. Thorne," he said softly. And we did. Winter finally broke, giving way to a muddy, ferocious spring, and then a lush, golden summer. With Vance gone, the siege on Ironwood evaporated. The federal government seized the bank, restructuring the debts of the ranches Vance had extorted. The pristine spring water flowing beneath our land remained ours, clear and untouched. But it wasn't just survival that came to Ironwood, it was prosperity. With the $200 in prize money, Silas bought the finest seed and medicine. The herd calved beautifully, filling the green valleys with life. As for me, I didn't stop cooking. I expanded. I started baking pies, curing massive hams, and making my spiced honey cakes. Once a week, Elias and Boone would drive a wagon loaded with my goods to the neighboring towns. The irony was sweet. The very society women of Oakhaven who had called me a beast now paid exorbitant prices to have my pastries served at their parlor tables. The money I made didn't just buy flour. It paid off the last of Ironwood's debt. Boone never left. He worked off his debt for the ruined flour with brutal, back-breaking labor. When his sentence was up, Silas told him he was free to ride out. Boone refused. He walked into my kitchen, took off his hat, and asked if he could learn to bake. He became my sous chef, measuring sugar and chopping wood, trading his arrogance for a quiet, steady loyalty. Ironwood was no longer a dying beast. It was a sanctuary. It was late December when the first snow of the new winter began to fall. I stood in my kitchen. It was no longer the cramped, freezing, ash-covered box I'd walked into a year ago. Silas and the men had spent the autumn tearing down the walls and building it 3 times larger. It had a massive double hearth, vast oak countertops built specifically for my height, and a pantry that was bursting with preserved foods, cured meats, and enough flour to feed an army for a year. The air was thick with the smell of roasting garlic, fresh thyme, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of rising dough. I stood at the table, humming softly to myself, driving the heels of my scarred hands into a massive mound of dough. My heavy wool dress was pushed up past my elbows. Outside the frosted windows, the sky was turning a bruised, beautiful purple as the snow fell in thick, silent sheets. The heavy oak door unlatched, letting in a swirl of icy wind. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of those heavy boots. Silas stepped inside, closing the cold out behind him. He unbuckled his gun belt, hanging it on the peg by the door. He shrugged off his heavy, snow-dusted sheepskin coat, hanging it next to my oversized apron. The kitchen was warm, the fire roaring cheerfully, but Silas brought the fresh, sharp scent of pine and winter air with him as he crossed the room. I kept kneading the dough, my broad shoulders moving in a rhythmic, powerful dance. Silas didn't say a word. He stepped up right behind me. He was the only man in the world large enough to make me feel small. His chest, solid and immovable as a mountain, pressed flush against my broad back. He wrapped his massive, muscular arms entirely around me, crossing them over my stomach, pulling me back into his heat. I sighed, letting my weight settle against him, the dough forgotten on the floured wood. Silas buried his face in the crook of my neck. I felt the rough, familiar rasp of his scarred cheek against my skin, sending a deep, thrilling shiver down my spine. He inhaled deeply, breathing in the scent of butter, flour, and my skin. "The herd is bedded down," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that traveled straight from his chest into mine. "The barn is secured. Let it snow." I turned my head slightly, catching his lips in a slow, deep kiss that tasted of the cold outside and the burning fire within. "Are you hungry?" I murmured against his mouth. "Starving," he growled, kissing his way along my jawline, his heavy hands gripping my waist with a fierce, possessive strength. "But not for food." I laughed, a rich, deep sound that echoed in the beautiful kitchen we had built together. For 26 years, the world had told me I was too big, too loud, too strong, too scarred to be loved. They had tried to push me into the corners, to make me shrink, to make me apologize for the space I commanded. But standing here, enveloped in the arms of a giant who looked at me like I hung the moon, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't a monster. I wasn't an outcast. I was the beating, unyielding heart of ironwood. And in the fierce, absolute sanctuary of Silas Thorne's embrace, I took up exactly the right amount of space. This story teaches us that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the people society underestimates are the ones who rise the highest. Here we tell stories of cowboys, frontier life, love, resilience, and human connection in its rawest form. If this story inspired you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, share it with others, and subscribe for more.